High tide is early this morning, and so after Zazen, I head off for the beach. As I'm walking along the cliff, I spot an elderly man bending down and feeding a gull from his hand. It's a wonderful sight to see. So many people in Ramsgate hate the gulls, or are scared of them, and I want to take up my phone to interview him about it, but it doesn't seem appropriate somehow. In any case, I can't just record people without asking them. As I approach, I say good morning and remark about the gull. The man has gentle and calm energy. It's almost like he's floating a few inches from the ground. He's not, of course, but he's passive and yet connected, the feeling I sometimes get in a meditation, when you stop processing things in your mind and just exist in your awareness. He's dressed from another era, in wool trousers and cloth cap. I've been feeding this girl for 10 years, he tells me, and his father before him. They live up to 30 years, you know. He roosts over there on the roof of that building. They're beautiful creatures and intelligent. As I look down at the curious creature, I cannot disagree. It's so sleek, its feathers so white, and it's so alive. You can recognise me coming even if I have a hat and coat on, he tells me. People talk about bird brain, but they're so clever. When the bird has gobbled up the morsel of bread, he takes off in a sweeping arc out towards the nest. Do they mate for life? I ask him. They do, he replies, and I want to ask him if he's married or he's alone, but I don't want to pry. He looks after his fledglings well, the man tells me, but when they're old enough he gives them the boot and they have to fend for themselves. Sounds a bit like my upbringing, I think to myself in a surge of self-pity, but I don't share the thought. It's too self-indulgent, and what's happening here is more important than me. So many people in Ramsgate hate gulls, I tell him, but isn't it a wonderful thing to interact with nature? Yes, he nods knowingly, and they've been here for a lot longer than us. Are you a Ramsgate man? I ask. I am, he tells me, all my life. And as we look down at the port, he tells me how the ferries would come in from Ostend and the hovercraft from Calais. What do you think about the night cargo flights? I ask him. I have mixed feelings, he replies. I remember when the Americans were at Manston with their jets during the Cold War. They would make quite a racket roaring around with their afterburners on, protecting us against invasion. I doubt they were here to protect us, I think to myself. But he's noticed my cynicism. How about you, he asks me. I'm not a fan, I tell him. There'll inevitably be noise and air pollution, and I don't think it's a good thing to import food from the other side of the world. We could be growing more here. He nods in agreement, and there's no judgment, no ego. He's able to listen, and I feel calm and happy in his presence. And when we say goodbye up there on the cliff, with the fresh air and the sweeping gulls, and the sun lying low in the morning light, we exchange names and a smile, and I hope that I'll see him again. The current police station is on York Street, which is a quaint street of Georgian shops stretching down to the harbour, or would be if it weren't dwarfed by a colossal row of ugly red brick buildings opposite that would look more at home in, say, Reading or anywhere ugly. The old police station on Cavendish Street is a much bigger building, now being turned into more exclusive apartments, and demonstrates that at one time Ramsgate had a large police presence. I'd be intrigued to know what was taking place in those days to warrant such a building, and I'm curious to know what level of crime Ramsgate suffers from today. I ring the bell at the desk, and a middle-aged lady, I'm guessing from her clothes is actually a civilian, says she'll be happy to pass on my request for an interview to the sergeant. Months later, I've heard nothing back. No doubt they have more important things to do, and I don't doubt what they have to do is endless. But judging by the old photographs of the town, where uniformed police are a visible presence, and who have an air of authority about them that is absent today, there was a relationship between them and the general public, and it was more one of respect. Today it seems the police on the street are either trying to be your friend, or they're tasing you, and they don't always make the right judgment calls. Like the time I was attacked in London by someone having a psychotic episode and spent the night in the cell for my pains. It seems a bit unfair to criticise the police, given the difficulty of their job and with such limited resources. But it's worth noting that somehow they've become separate from the rest of us, in a way which I don't think was the case 50 years ago. And in trying to be more accessible to the public, they've effectively sabotaged the regard in which they were once held, and have added themselves to the long list of institutions that have eroded the trust of the public. Around the time the police force was created by Sir Robert Peel, and hence the name Bobbies and Peelers, a new Anglican church was being built in Vale Square. The architect of the medieval Gothic building was Sir George Gilbert Scott, ironically an admirer of Augustus Pugin, who was simultaneously building his Catholic church next to his house The Grange on the West Cliff. There was a fierce rivalry between the two denominations. Both had philanthropic ambitions in the town and thought that God was on their side. The vicar of Christ Church, Edward Hoare, called Pugin the devil incarnate and stirred up such anti-Catholic feeling that his house was mobbed and pelted with shit. Ramsgate is pretty quiet now in comparison, and resentment is now reserved for the district council, but that hasn't yet resulted in a shit show as far as I know. The number of people going to church in Ramsgate is tiny compared to the glory days of the Victorian era, and I wonder what we've lost now we don't have God. Who can we turn to for moral guidance? Not our leaders by all accounts. Pope Francis said that more important than the doctrine of the Holy Catholic Church is the voice of your own conscience. He called it the interior space in which we can listen to and hear the truth, the good, the voice of God. I like that because it reminds me that we all have this incredible power within us. It's not separate. It is actually us. You just have to listen, perhaps do a lot more meditation in my case. But the promise of more, in terms of consumption, is a lie. And the happiest people, they say, are the ones who do things for other people. I'm not saying that good and evil don't exist, but I believe the energy that's produced when both equal and opposite forces flow and everything comes into balance is love. Coming out of my dream this morning, which was infinitely more real than my waking life, although I've now forgotten the details, I had a revelation of sorts, and I feel better for it. And that's that I've been suffering from lockdown isolation and sex deprivation, and that old chestnut, my life has no meaning. Yesterday I went out as usual and did my Tai Chi routine at the beach. It felt good, although the sun was struggling to come out. I didn't swim, it was too rough, and it was bloody freezing. I know that if my hands are cold when I have my gloves on, they're going to get frostbite in water at that temperature. I go into the deli on the way back and buy a loaf of bread, even though I decided to give up bread because I'm so bloated. I decide not to chat with the Polish lady and try and pretend to be normal. And she's completely fine and not awkward. But on the way out, I wonder if she actually recognised me because I had my face covered, and then I realised that I'm overthinking it. I need some provisions, but the supermarket has a queue around the block, and I make a right into town. I've been toying with the idea of going vegetarian, but for reasons I can't explain, I walk straight into the butcher's and buy a pork loin, even though I decided only this morning to go back to eating brown rice and vegetables. Perhaps I thought I was going in there for eggs and got distracted. On the way out, a little voice comes into my head and goes, "You'll need a glass of cider with that." And I go, where did that come from? And so I find myself at home with a full pack of cider and a large cigar. Okay, I think I'm depressed. I must be. I keep letting out long sighs and muttering, "Oh God," under my breath as I walk around the house. Yes, I'm definitely depressed. And somehow I think a can of cider will fix it, but I also know that it won't. Once I've had some cider, I can't do any writing and decide to finish painting the stairs. And that actually works out pretty well. But by the time I've finished, so is the cider and the cigar. And so I nip back out and buy a bottle of wine. Pretty soon I'm in bed, pissed, watching a Woody Allen movie. And I can't stand Woody Allen. Well, not since he married his daughter. And his later films are boring. I let out a long sigh. Something has got to give. I send my girlfriend a message saying I wish I could buy her dinner in Paris. The movie is set in Paris. But I don't really have a girlfriend. And it's doubtful that I'll ever see her in Paris or anywhere else for that matter. Although we did have a great time in Paris. I think about calling the erotic photographer, but I can't decide if that would be unfaithful or not. And she hasn't indicated she has any interest in me, other than telling me she's training to be a dominatrix. God, my back hurts. And my head. After a long night of interrupted sleep, I get up and have a shower and get dressed. My trousers are so tight I can't do them up. I put on so much weight during lockdown. I try on several other pairs, but they're all tight. And I laugh as I tell myself that I haven't lost any weight. After all, I haven't had any bread for nearly 8 hours now. So I put on the first pair again. They're partly elasticated. I go downstairs and grab my boots and hat and scarf. I open the front door and check the temperature. Gosh, it's really quite cold. I'd better wear my duffel coat, I think to myself. And I sling it on and head down to the front to meet my friend. The cold air makes me feel better, in spirit as well as body. And by the time I get down to the harbour, I'm feeling better about life. My friend is about the same age, a couple of years older perhaps, but he looks a lot older than I think I do, which is not saying much. We get coffee at Little Ships, which he remarks is a bit expensive for where it is. Basically a town where nobody has any money except the visitors and the second homers. There's a biting wind down at the harbour. My fingers already frozen from checking my phone as I was walking down the hill, and the sea is really pretty lively. It's high tide and huge waves crash into the sea wall, making the Sunday walkers scream with delight. People seem to love it, but I stay away not wishing to get soaked, and remembering when a family of visiting Swedes who made it across the North Sea in a 30-foot yacht were swept off the harbour wall on their way to the brasserie, which was closed. No, the sea is angry today. Best treat it with respect. We walk onto the beach and find some seats outside the pavilion, where there's a windbreak. I explain that what I'm interested in, for the book that is people's values and how different they are. He has this theory about how people are waiting to be told what to do by the government. And there are also the people who blame the government for everything that goes wrong. Like, why can't you tell us when the pandemic will be over? Which is a particularly stupid question, I always think. And he goes on to explain that this is a time when society has become fractured and people are moving towards self-governance, especially with all the online platforms. And I think of all those companies like Google and Instagram are like nations in themselves, and they have the power that formerly only governments or dictators had. I mean, Branson and Bezos are now both astronauts. Pity we can't send Boris into outer space. The next morning I'm not up for any time before I find myself filling a hot water bottle and heading back to bed with a mug of liver detox tea. Outside, the gulls fly around the church tower, and amongst the odd cry the sparrows sing descant in the hedgerows. The sun has warmed up the window now, and beams of light lay across the bed. Perhaps I'll swim today. It's time I got back into that. I check my emails and see there's a bill from my renewable power company. I'd switched from the big French nuclear one because of their awful customer service, even though they were the cheapest. It strikes me that though I try hard to avoid having the central heating on all the time, most people would just crank it up in cold weather. So I pay about £80 a month for gas and electric combined, which is nearly a quarter of my income at present, or would be if I had an income. And so for most people who want their houses to be warm most of the time, they must be paying at least double that, and probably more. Firstly, I wonder how anyone could afford it, and secondly, why would anyone want to live in a house that hot? I hear on the radio that the average household temperature in the 1960s was 12 degrees Celsius, and today is more like 20. I kind of like making myself warm as opposed to being warm all the time, and so I go downstairs and fill my hot water bottle. I know that's going to use energy, but it's not as bad as heating the whole house. I listen to the radio while I wait for the kettle to boil, and a voice announces that central heating accounts for a quarter of UK natural gas emissions. A quarter of UK gas emissions, good God. So keeping warm and toasty in the house is destroying the planet. How come I didn't know that? And if I don't know it, then all those people who are keeping warm and toasty definitely don't know it. I have this theory that people who get cold easily are also the kind of people who get stuck in their heads, people who think too much. They're kind of ignoring their bodies. I mean, the brain is actually all over the body, especially down the spine, and not just in the head. And if you ignore the body, not only are you going to get cold, but get ill. So it follows therefore that global warming is caused by unconscious thinking. I Google the UK emissions figures and find a government site that proudly announces big reductions of emissions in the last 10 years, and that would reassure anyone, including myself. But being a natural cynic, I can't trust figures when it comes to emissions or anything else. They're not true exactly, but half true, and you know what that means. I look at the section of the chart for transport. I hate cars, as you know. Emissions from road transport, domestic aviation, railways and domestic shipping only includes emissions from vehicles and not from transport-related infrastructure or from heating or air conditioning. International aviation and shipping emissions are not included in national totals. Okay, so the figures don't include international travel, and given that the bulk of air travel in the UK is international, the statistics don't give a true picture. I was quite surprised that Radio 4 even mentioned emissions, because after all that's been reported recently is when someone thinks a COVID jab will roll out and we can all get back to normal. So by get back to normal, people mean getting back to being obsessed with economic growth, getting back in the car and going to work, stopping by the supermarket on the way home and stocking up on sugar and plastic, and getting home and switching on the television and cranking the central heating up. Actually, the heating has been blasting away all day anyway to ensure it's nice and toasty when we get home. Thank God for the thermostat. Yes, let's all be in a hurry to get back to that. So COVID has not been a big enough problem to make people change. House prices are going up during COVID, so that's a good thing, as long as you own a house. It makes homeowners feel better about themselves, and the poor people who don't own property feel worse about themselves, because they'll think they'll never be able to afford one. And in any case, no one wants to rent because it's money down the drain, and the law doesn't stop landlords exploiting their tenants anymore. When I moved into Paradise, I had a pair of bruisers who kept knocking on the door, looking for a former tenant who owed money. The men were both dressed in black and looked like a cross between the police and the SAS, and both of them with shaved heads and tattoos. One would stand by the vehicle while the other banged on the door, just like in the movies. On the third occasion they called, they asked to see my passport or driving licence, and I told them to take a hike. I never saw them again. All they had to do was Google the property and they would have seen that it had just been sold. Turned out the man that they were looking for was dead. And even if you buy a leasehold, which is where you buy the right to live in a property but don't really own it, then you're at the mercy of the landlords and the legal system in which they're necessarily expert. That's how they make their money, and your right to live somewhere is put into question. Some forward-thinking politician tried to abolish the leasehold system, but the House of Lords threw it out because, surprise, surprise, most of them are landlords, and the £305 attendance allowance for turning up in the House of Lords and stuffing your face with gourmet food in the subsidised restaurant just isn't enough, even with travel expenses from the country seat thrown in as a perk. In Thanet too we have our politicians and wannabe politicians, and while some want to do good, others tell themselves they are doing good, and a few want to be good to themselves, and it's not much different to what's going on up there in Parliament. No, COVID just isn't enough of a disaster to bring positive change. Our leaders don't want change. The word conserve means to keep the same. Why would the Conservative Party want to change the status quo where they're on top? And who could blame them? Which I do, of course. But really we can only blame ourselves, can't we? At the very least, any of us can be responsible for ourselves. And that's if we're truly free to make our own choices. Which if greed and equality are protected by law, then we're not. I know that I'm not actually standing on the edge of the cliff, but that I'm imagining it. I'm not really there, but it looks real, super real in fact, and I can feel the breeze on my face and hear voices in the distance and the gulls calling to one another up above. And as I step closer, that feeling of paralysis, the same feeling I got when the LSD kicked in that time when I was a teenager and I thought I might disappear into a hole in the ground, infects my entire body. And I'm no longer the driver, but the passenger, no, the prisoner, being carried along by some unstoppable and predetermined force. I feel myself struggle in mid-air, and then the terrible impact, and all the pain of crushing bones and flesh, and yet I'm still alive, but don't have a body anymore, and then the damning shame of a discarded life. Or on the underground platform in London or New York, I hear the train coming, and I get ready, and I jump, and I feel the excruciating pain of being torn into 100 pieces, and I can see the faces of the people traumatized by witnessing such a display of self-indulgence. Mind you, the train company has to compensate them all, I hear. But discovering my dead body at the bottom of a cliff in Ramsgate is not going to earn anyone any money. And I think that's what stops me doing it. And the legacy my children would inherit. No, better not do that. Perhaps swimming out to sea would be a good way. Drunk, of course, in case at the last minute I should change my mind. You know, just keep swimming until you're so exhausted, you just sink to the bottom. And then my kids, who are not kids anymore, would think that I'd drown by accident. Oh, Dad loved swimming in the sea. He used to go all year round. What a guy. But what would it be like drowning and your life flashing before your eyes? No, I've seen that movie. I've lived it, in fact. Maybe I should just smoke and drink myself to death like my parents did. Oh, I'm already doing that. I think I need a distraction. I'm hungry. Or maybe I should watch porn. But that's not real either. Though sometimes it's safer than being with a woman. Or see if I can find something I don't need on Amazon. God, it's cold in here. But I ain't putting on the heating. I better get up. Outside on the high street, I see a small truck hauling out a vintage car from the TV Bond lot. He was the old fellow who had the iron foundry behind the Dutch gabled house, the one that was a compulsory purchase by the council and sold to a developer who demolished it. I stick around on the corner and take a few photos. I'm curious to know what will happen to this piece of land. I can see a woman talking to the truck driver, and as she crosses the road towards me, she says, "I know you from somewhere. What are you doing hanging out on street corners looking suspicious?" "Do you want to buy some drugs?" I reply. "No," she says. In any case, she doesn't look the type. She's an older woman who wants to be younger, I decide. She tells me there are foxes living on that piece of land, and she doesn't want the men to disturb them when they're pulling out the cars. Well, good luck with that one, I think to myself. I'm more interested to know what's happened to Mr. Bond's estate, the money he left to Ramsgate Hospital, because there was no family left to leave it to. The lady tells me the NHS now own the land, which makes sense given that Ramsgate Hospital is now flats. I ask her if she remembers the Dutch gable house that was demolished on the site just a few years ago. She remembers the house being pulled down, she tells me, but it wasn't a Dutch gable house, but a shop, or two shops rather, and she has a picture of it upstairs that she took at the time. Well, that's bollocks, I think to myself. But she flutters her eyelashes, smiles, and asks me up to the flat, and being more than a little curious about what happened to the Dutch gable house, I agree to go with her. I follow her up a number of flights of stairs to the very top of the building, into her apartment. It's a rental, she tells me, which I take as an apology for it being a bit scruffy. But it has a spectacular bird's eye view of the street below, including the plot where the demolished building once stood. Of course, I know it wasn't a shop, because I distinctly remember the red brick Dutch gable house. I could describe it perfectly from memory. And I stand there impatiently as she trawls through all her pictures on her computer to try and locate it. Just as I'm about to tell her that I've got better things to do than look at pictures of her grandchildren, she finds the snap, and guess what? It was a shop. Or two shops, rather, and Victorian rather than Georgian. There's no mistake about it. I can clearly see the building next to it, which still stands. I mean, it's a shame they were demolished, especially as there aren't that many shops left, at least not at this end of the high street. But I distinctly remembered an 18th century Dutch gabled house, and it turns out it was a complete fantasy that I had created, and I believed it to be true. I had even written to the council about it, demanding to know how they had allowed a listed building, or at least one that should have been listed, to be demolished. Mind you, they didn't bother to correct me. They were too interested in protecting themselves. When I told this to the lady, she said, "Aren't you embarrassed?" And I thought for a moment and said, "No, not really, because you learn so much from making mistakes." And then she asked me if I was worried about going senile, I think she meant. And I said I wasn't, but more curious to know how I could create something so real in my mind. She didn't really understand what I meant by that, and continued to flirt with me like a schoolgirl. And I thought, what is she doing? She must be 70 if she's a day. And then I thought, because you're 60, mate, so you're no spring chicken either, or a spring cock for that matter. Good God, is this what it's going to be like from now on? Because I still see myself as 35, which I thought was pretty silly when I heard my mum say it. But she didn't get it. She didn't understand that I wasn't the slightest bit worried about being wrong, but rather I was glad of it. I wouldn't have swapped it for the truth. Even now I know it isn't the truth. In fact, it's given the imaginary Dutch gable house a kind of immortality. It does exist, but in another reality, a reality of dreams that I've created. And many ancient cultures would recognise the deeper meaning in that. And it's not just mumbo-jumbo, but it's scientific, quantum physics reality. And if everything is made of vibrating atoms and molecules, that includes us, I mean humanity, and therefore we all have a say in what happens, in what's real and what is imagined. And what's wrong with being a solipsist anyhow? In the upstairs bedroom of 11 Spencer Square, young Vincent looks at his reflection in the window pane as he ties his bow tie. His attention, though, is on the clouds moving through the trees behind the house. And as the first peal of the church bell strikes, he discards his tie and leaves the room. We walk with him as he hurries down into Royal Road and crosses into Vale Square. Others, dressed in their Sunday best, have already started to file into Christchurch. Vincent stops to allow a group of ladies to pass by, in their silk dresses with bustles for bottoms, and their faces framed by the brightly coloured ribbons holding on their bonnets. Vincent steps back deferentially and takes a little bow and smiles an innocent smile at the pretty one. But in return she scowls at his scruffy clothes and no tie, and turns towards the church door with her nose to the heavens. He watches them file into the church, but when it's his turn to follow, he has a sudden change of heart and wheels around and strides off towards the West Cliff and the sea. Gulls swoop on the currents of rising air, and the sandpipers chase the moving shadows on the sand as the sea laps against his boots. Everyone who works with love and with intelligence finds in the very sincerity of his love for nature and art a kind of armour against the opinions of other people. In spite of everything, I shall rise again. I shall take up my pencil, which I have forsaken in my great discouragement, and I will go on with my drawing. Amongst the asphalt and flowers of Spencer Square now sits Vincent's head. The lifeless bronze is so removed from my own vision of him. Here he's a gaunt and tortured-looking man, with paintbrush and palette, pipe and pistols, the accessories of his life and his death. A pair of sad-looking sunflowers complete the empty scene. He was too sensitive, they say, and he went mad, and he killed himself. But what about his lust for life, I say? His love for the sea and the sky and the birds and the flowers? Isn't that being alive? Isn't that more real than pretending to be real? As I try and listen for more words, the thumping bass from the leisure centre's step class starts up, and I shut my computer and head off to the sea to ask him. The boys leave tomorrow. I say boys, they're 28 and 35, though the younger one is more mature emotionally. From the sound of it, he's had a very stable upbringing, surrounded by animals, and with parents who liked him. The 35-year-old isn't insecure, in terms of attachment theory, and in terms of life. No doubt another victim of childhood, and who now finds it difficult to empathise, although I doubt he's aware of it. He has the name of his dog tattooed on his arm, but he doesn't feed or walk the dog, not at regular times anyway, and as any dog owner will tell you, dogs get anxious when they don't have a routine. I like all three of them, although it became evident that I was basically their parent, and probably more mum than dad. Amongst the challenges has been the 10-minute showers, them cooking with silver cutlery, burning the pans, heating the oven for just half a baguette, leaving lights on, pissing on the bathroom floor, and leaving the lavatory seat up, and having the dog on the bed. This morning I find the knob on the kettle is broken, which is basically because boys, and I include myself in this, are not as gentle as girls and tend to hit things too hard, or over-tighten the taps, or whatever it is. It's too late to tell anybody off, and in any case that would be as unwelcome for me as it would be for them. So I say nothing, and try and order one from the manufacturer. Of course they don't supply knobs, because the kettle is not designed to be repaired, which makes me feel a little depressed. That's the price we pay for cheap consumer goods, I guess, and in my mind I see a mountain of stainless steel kettles with broken switches, amongst all the other broken electrical goods, up at the recycling centre in the sky. So we just recycle the materials now, whilst before we'd recycle the parts. But recycling isn't cheap, and it isn't even green. Those Asian countries that used to process the recycling will no longer take it. So the cost of the kettle isn't just £28.99, it's also the cost of the environment in recycling the materials and then mining for more iron to make the steel and oil to make the plastic. And the transport costs as the kettle was made in China, even though it's a British company. But we want cheap goods, and spending money grows the economy and the government is grateful. I mean, if we had to pull water from the well every time we needed a shower, we wouldn't have 10-minute showers. And even these young millennial men who are aware of the problems facing the planet, much more so than my generation, still worship the god of personal convenience. We decide to have lunch together in the garden. It's a nice day, and it'll be the last opportunity to get together before they leave. I go out and buy ribeye steaks, and the 28-year-old buys beer, and the 35-year-old doesn't buy anything. I don't mind, because I know he can't help it, and in any case he's happy today, and he's quite funny when he's happy, which I always appreciate, although he does tend to repeat himself a lot, which I don't. Did I mention he's bipolar? I realise that with beer and wine with lunch and a cigar, I'm not going to make Tai Chi tonight, and instead we watch a movie all about Nina with Mary Elizabeth Winstead, who I love nearly as much as my girlfriend, and who is just as unattainable. The 35-year-old produces a bottle of whiskey, and we sip that while watching the film. He then dials up a gram of Coke, from Margate of course, which incredibly arrives within 10 minutes of ordering it, and is delivered by a Romanian in an Audi. It's 40 quid compared with the usual 60 quid a gram, which dealers have been charging since ancient times, so I wasn't expecting much. And it's basically speed. I haven't taken drugs for years, decades actually, but for reasons I can't explain, I forget for a moment that I'm a middle-aged man who shouldn't be doing those things. After a couple of lines and a couple of more whiskies, I message my girlfriend telling her I want to marry her and have a baby, and she messages back saying, "You on the whiskey or something?" And I'm thinking, how do they always know? Then we run out of whiskey, and I suggest that we need more booze, and the boys suddenly produce a bottle of bubbly and a card where they say how much they've enjoyed their stay and what a wonderful guy I am. That's really very sweet, I say, and we all have a hug.